So welcome. Today's session is going to be on the VM Recovery Manager for HA IBM offering. I decided to go ahead and create a new series. If you're familiar with my YouTube channel, you may have already watched the series that I put together on the VM Recovery Manager for disaster recovery. This offering is independent, so even though it has the same foundation, it is licensed separately. So you can go ahead and set up the cases management LPARs type HA. I decided to go ahead and put together another series since I continue to get a lot of questions on this. And part one, I decided to go ahead and cover concepts and what it takes to actually deploy this type of solution. So as I did in the previous series, I went ahead and I wanted to show you what the disaster recovery looks like and how the HA actually differs. So on the top of the screen, you'll see that I've got a cases management LPAR at the secondary site up on the top right, and he is currently managing the colored virtual machines on the center of the screen. And if I went ahead and I executed a movement operation via that cases manager, he would go ahead and effectively suspend those manage LPARs and allow me to relocate them from one site to the secondary site. So it would bring them online and it would go ahead and perform a clean on the source. It is leveraging block level replication, and we do have integration with different offerings. So IBM's replication, EMC, Hitachi. And it is intended for disaster recovery, even though in some scenarios it may come into play in a stretch clustered configuration. On the left-hand side, I also showed you that it's got a product ID of 5765-DRG, so it is orderable if you find that product ID. And then if I now load up the bottom of the screen, you'll see that we have an HA offering. It's 5765 VRM, and it is a completely different construct as far as how you go ahead and configure this. You would still wind up having a management LPAR, and that's what I've got drawn on the bottom right of the screen. So I've got a cases LPAR, but he is going to be configured as type HA. And if you look at the bottom of that picture, you'll see that I have a shared SAN storage yellow box drawn in. So this is really intended for a local data center type of configuration. The host group construct will effectively say that these are the participating members that are going to participate in these in this grouping, and then I can go ahead and manage or unmanage virtual machines inside of that grouping. That host group does not have to be just two machines. It can scale all the way up to 12 different servers. And then if I go ahead and I load up a new animation, you'll see in the bottom of the screen that if I had 12 different machines, I might have a whole bunch of LPARs or virtual machines actively running on those systems. The way that this solution works, in contrast to the one up top with disaster recovery, where I would have to go ahead and initiate the actual move from site to site, this one is intended for automatic restart of the virtual machines. So if one of those green machines were to go ahead and fail on me, it would automatically get started on one of the other potential viable targets. And I can get fancy and set up different types of criteria that says, don't go to this host, but go ahead and go to a different one. I can set co-location policies or anti-co-location policies, but you'll see that the scaling lets me go up to 12 different hosts within that host group, and that's really because we support up to 24 VIO servers. So if I had more than 2 VIO servers on a machine, I could go ahead and say don't touch these VIO servers, so I can still scale up to 12 systems. Or it would reduce the max number of systems that I could have within that grouping. I am not limited to strictly 12 systems in a cases configuration, so I might have multiple host groups. So you'll see that on the top I've got host group A, 12 systems. I might have a completely separate host group still managed by that cases management LPAR. Again, another potential 12 systems for that grouping. And then my host groups don't have to scale all the way up to 12. Maybe I don't have that many machines. So you'll see that I've got 5 different hosts on the bottom host group. So the concept here is that these are groupings. The virtual machines will be mobile, so you can through the interface perform live partition mobility operations, remote restart operations, and then you'll have the automatic restarts that the solution actually offers. The nice thing is that these are not clustered VMs per se by default if you choose to leverage VM Recovery Manager. So it's kind of a hands-off approach where you're doing the monitoring from the outside in. As I go through the remainder of the session, you'll see that we kind of take it a step further. We don't just check to see if they're up or not. We can have agents running inside of the VMs, and we can do automated things within the VM itself, where we might try to relocate it and get restarted on a different host, or we may try to restart your application without having to move or shut down or relocate that virtual machine at all. Requirement-wise, that cases management LPAR can reside on any of the systems. More than likely, you'd want to have it in a separate machine from the machines that it's managing. And he's going to basically require AIX running on it with one processor and 8 gigs of memory. So it's a pretty thin virtual machine. Those are the same exact requirements that you have for a VM recovery manager for disaster recovery. As far as the overall management of the environment, they do recommend that you have dual HMCs. Obviously, you can have more than two. In my particular test environment, I'm testing with a single one, so you're not hard-coded to two, but they do recommend dual HMCs for redundancy, and it is version 911 and above. And server-wise, you can intermix machines. In my particular environment, I've got a combination of Power 8 and Power 9, but you can go all the way back to Power 7 machines going forward, and that's really based on the firmware requirements. So we've been asked a number of times, can I go with just plain vanilla Power 7 machines? And no, you cannot, because we don't support the older levels of firmware before that. As far as the underlying hypervisor, we do require PowerVM. You're going to want to have PowerVM Enterprise Edition and Live Partition Mobility capabilities. And then we do recommend dual VIO servers. What's different from this configuration than a VM Recovery Manager for DR is that you're going to want to have two LUNs assigned to all of the participating VIO servers. So if you have non-participating VIO servers, they don't have to see those two disks, but one is going to be an HA disk, another one's going to be a repository disk. All you're really doing is provisioning those LUNs, and then the cases controller and the VM Recovery Manager deployment, it's going to go ahead and take care of what needs to happen on those disks behind the scenes. So they're going to be very hands-off once you allocate what disks they're actually going to be. There are some recommendations as far as resources on those VIO servers. If you read the documentation, they do recommend increasing the amount of processing power that you have on your VIO servers slightly. They do give you some recommendations to increase the memory on the VIO servers as well. I have not in my particular environment. That's going to kind of be up to you as far as how far you want to go up, but those are the baselines that they're recommending. Storage-wise, we do support import ID virtualization or virtual SCSI mappings, and you're going to want to be configured so that the VMs within the host group can perform live partition mobility operations. What you don't need to have is you don't need to be enabled for simplified remote restart. More than likely you may be set up, but the remote restart capabilities of the VM Recovery Manager are not relying on the fact that you have that particular flag set. So let's go ahead and go through a deploy, and like I did on the VM Recovery Manager for DR, I'll show you the syntax, and then logically I'll take you through the flow as far as what you would need to go ahead and get this configured. So for starters, you're going to need that cases management LPAR installed with AIX. Once I install the packages, I'm going to want to make sure that I've got the VM Recovery Manager code on it, and I'm going to go ahead and, like I did on the DR setup, I'm going to go ahead and assign a cluster name. So if you look up my syntax, I'm doing a cases manager add cases cluster, giving it a name, specifying my node name, setting the sync flag to yes, and then type HA. For the DR one, it was a type DR. So this cases management LPAR today with the existing release can only be configured as type HA or type DR. If I continue going forward, I'm going to go ahead and register the HMCs. They're the ones that actually handshake with the servers themselves. So I'm going to want to go ahead and add those guys. And there's syntactically what's taken place. I only added one in my particular environment, and then I ran a second command. I queried the HMC. That's going to dump output with the systems that HMC is actually managing. Now, maybe not all of those systems are going to participate in this cases configuration, and that's fine. So I'm going to go ahead and, once I see those hosts listed out, I'm going to go ahead and add them into the cases configuration. So you'll see that syntactically, I went ahead and I added two hosts. I happen to have an S824 and then an S922 participating. My particular HMC was seeing a total, I believe, of 4 hosts, but I'm only using 2. And then I did another query command, and the reason that I did that is to get my VIO server names. So if I ran a cases manager query VIOS, it's going to dump out the VIO servers that I have in those systems. Really, it would have dumped out, if you saw the output, the 4 names that you see in the follow-on command. And there's a cases manager query VIO disks. What that's going to show me is if it does see that you took those 2 LUNs that are required and provisioned them across the 4 VIO servers, it's going to dump out potential options. In my environment, it would have only dumped out 2. Everything else was committed for other things. And then in my very next command, I'm going to go ahead and create the host group definition. That's going to say, these are the two systems or however many systems that are going to participate in my host group. I'm going to name it. I happen to call my host group Oracle VM HG. And then I'm going to specify the two disks. And in that previous command, it would have dumped out a long ID for those disks. So disk 1 was 10 gigs. Notice that it's categorizing them. So one of them is a repo disk, and then the other one is an HA disk. I press enter, and it's effectively creating my host group for me. So the host group definition encompasses the two hosts that I defined, and then it's going to go ahead and take those two disks and automatically going to create a shared storage pool, and behind the scenes it's going to use one of the disks as an HA disk and then the other one as the repository disk. You don't have to do anything extra or do any setup. It's going to go ahead and handle it on its own. The other thing that it's going to actually do, now it's going to have you do a discovery, and I'm really going to do this twice. So the reason I do this is when I run the Cases Manager Discover, the name of the host group that I just defined, it's going to go ahead and manage every single one of the VMs. So if you look in the center of the screen, you'll see that it managed my AIX, my IBM I, my Linux VMs, even the other ones, the gray ones that maybe I didn't want it to manage. So by default, if I do the deploy via the CLI, it's going to try to manage everything. It behaves the same way with the current release for the VM Recovery Manager for DR offering. So the reason I did the discovery in two passes is so it discovers all of the virtual or LPARs, however you want to actually call them. But maybe I only want to manage a select few of them to start off with. So in my environment, I think I've got something along the lines of like 60 VMs, but really I only wanted to manage a handful of them. So syntactically, if you do a Cases Manager query VM, you'll see that it'll dump out every single VM and that it'll go ahead and try to manage all of them. So what they did is they added a command that lets you unmanage all of them. So I don't have to go individually and say, okay, unmanage 1, then 2, then 3. So you'll see that I ran two additional commands, Cases Manager Unmanage VM All, and I did it for the S922 and then for the S824. So since I knew I was only going to be doing a couple as far as the managing, I unmanaged everything, and then I ran that fourth command, that Cases Manager Manage, and for simplicity's sake, I kept it as just one virtual machine in this example. It happened to be called VRM-HA DB, and at the time it happened to reside on my S922 server. So when I do that, I'm going to go ahead and want to come back in and rerun a discovery. So that's why I said I did it in two pieces, and I did a discovery A and a second discovery. When I do the second discovery and verification operation, I'm going to leave it where it's only managing that single VM now. So my VRM-HA DB is going to be managed, and by default everything else will be unmanaged, and that's why I drew them in gray in the center. So there's my syntax as far as what I did to run the discovery against my host group and then the verification against the host group. The reason I showed you the syntax instead of actually running the operations, the discovery, depending on the number of VMs that you have, sometimes does take a little bit of time. So I'd rather do it this way, so at least you know what would actually take place, and then your mileage is going to vary based on the number of virtual machines that you have in your environment. And then from there on out, you're pretty much set up. You can come in and do some additional customization. And the next videos that I'll be doing, I'll show you some of the fancier things that you can do. At its simplest form, you may want to just go ahead and add notifications. So I went ahead and I created a user for this particular cases, and I plugged in my email address. So now anytime any warnings or events take place, I go ahead and get it, and I receive emails from the Cases Management LPAR. And then beyond this, all of this configuration was performed on the actual Cases LPAR. There is a separate agent that you can optionally install inside of each individual VM. And beyond just the host level failures, it'll allow you to do individual VM level detection, and it'll give you a framework where you can monitor the applications as well, so that if the application failed, it can go ahead and try to do restarts automatically or potentially relocate the virtual machine. So I'll do a deeper dive on that on a separate recording, but I just kind of wanted to give you the gist as far as the deployment within the management LPAR, and then that there are extra steps that you can optionally take inside of each individual separate LPARs. So this kind of gives you a picture as far as what I've got in my particular test environment. So I've got that Cases Management LPAR. He does reside in a completely different machine. So you'll see host 3 on the bottom right. He's not going to be part of my host group. And then I have the two participating machines, and the pictures are not accurate, but just they They just simply resemble the fact that I've got separate physical machines. I've got an S824 and an S922, and then I've got some form of store-wise shared storage behind the scenes. I do have dual VIO servers on both sides, and then I took you through the steps of configuring that host group. The shared storage pool cluster at the bottom automatically got created and basically became hands-off. And within that host group, the VMs that I'm currently managing and that you'll see throughout the videos that I'll put together are an Oracle-specific VM running on AIX, and then I purposely set up a PowerHA cluster. So I don't have to set up any type of PowerHA clustering, but I get asked all the time, would you install VM Recovery Manager HA if you were already clustered and manage those LPARs? You certainly can, you don't have to. The PowerHA would provide protection in the event that if you took a hit to that hosting LPAR on the left-hand side, your workload would move within a few seconds and start, getting acquired on the second side and start it automatically. And then VM Recovery Manager after the fact would automatically restart the VM on the local host or might try to restart it on a different host. Now, if you had PowerHA services set to automatically start up, it would automatically reintegrate that standby into the cluster, and you'd be protected again with the PowerHA software. So you're certainly not required to do clustering and then PowerHA on top of it, but you may see it in some instances. So this particular diagram is going to give you the gist as far as the different capabilities that you get with the VM Recovery Manager for HA solution. So one of the things that you get is the ability to perform live partition mobility operations. So you can do it at the individual VM level, or you can move all of the managed VMs off of that host. And then there's an attribute specific to each individual VM that gets set. So wherever it's deployed, it's going to go ahead and set a home host. So that way, if you ever evacuated a host, you could execute an operation saying, take me back to the home host, and it would return all the VMs to the way that they started. So that's one of the capabilities. In addition to that, you've got VM restart capabilities. So if one of the LPARs were to be offline, I could execute that restart operation, but I could say restart him either locally or restart him on a remote host. And if I had 12 hosts within that host group, I could start him up on any of them. Now, it's going to go ahead and recreate the VMs, bring them up, and do the cleanup on the source. And it is completely independent on whether the simplified remote restart flag is set or not on those VMs. The host failure detection, this is intended to be automated. So unlike our VM Recovery Manager for DR, if the host on the left-hand side that was hosting those two red and green VMs took a hit, those VMs would automatically get restarted. That is the default behavior. If some of the VMs you do not want to go ahead and automatically restart it, there is an advisory mode that you can go ahead and enable. So you would get notifications and then you could decide what actually happens. But the default intended behavior for this solution is the VMs getting restarted automatically in the event of a failure. So that's the one level of detection that you'll see. And if you look at the top left, I highlighted the fact that there's other tools that actually do this. So there are offerings from lab services like the LPM automation tool that allow you to set plans and evacuate machines. If you are leveraging things like or utilities like PowerVC, they have an automated remote restart function that if it detects that the host failed, it'll automatically restart all the VMs on different hosts. So we're very similar from that perspective, even though we're using our own internal logic. Where we take it a step further is we also can accommodate for individual VM level failures. So the fact that you can install now a package inside of those managed VMs, if a single VM failed, it would go ahead and try to restart them locally if the entire host had not gone down. And then if it could not get restarted locally, it would go ahead and restart them on the next available host. I've only got two, so he would go from my S824 to the S922. If I had 12 hosts, it could go to any of those additional hosts. There are restart maximums. So by default, it's going to try 3 times and then get relocated. You can alter that. So in my environment, I've changed it so that it tries to restart it locally only once, and then it goes ahead and tries to restart at the remote location. So I'll show you examples of that when I do the deeper dives in the follow-on recordings, but that's a VM level failure. In addition to that, they do provide an application framework. So they do include agents for SAP HANA, for Oracle, for DB2 and Postgres. And then if your particular application doesn't fall within that realm, you can go ahead and define your own application start, stop, and monitor scripts. and then leverage that framework so that if you detect a failure, your monitor may automatically try to restart the application locally, or may try to trigger the actual movement of the VM. Or simply send you notifications. So I've deployed it both ways. I installed the Oracle agent and I've been testing with it. And then I've also installed my own custom logic so that I can do monitoring. I can control the start and stop of my application. And then even though that happens to be a clustered LPAR, that PowerHA is kind of independent of the custom script logic that I defined within VM Recovery Manager. So that's kind of the big differentiating factor, and I highlighted that in green on the top. The fact that other utilities don't do or do not accommodate for VM or application level failures, you would need some type of separate tool in order to achieve that. This can do it for you, provides the framework, and can also do it at scale. And the nice thing is that it's very hands-off. Once I have this configured, if it detects the failure, it does the movement or the restart automatically. So I showed you how to do the actual deploy via the CLI. Now I'm going to go ahead and take you into an emulator just to save a little bit of time and just to show you that you could do the entire deployment via the GUI user interface as well. And then I'll show you some of the management capabilities that you get. All right, so went ahead and I launched one of the emulators here, and I simply did this just for speed's sake. I didn't want to go ahead and have to redeploy my cases management LPAR. So this will take you through the same exact screens as if I was doing a deploy from the ground up. So I simply went to the actual login screen. It's going to ask me if I want to go ahead and add a cases. I can start filling in some of the details like the cases name, the user ID and password, and then the cluster type. You'll see that I designated it as type HA. I can go ahead and save it. The flow here is slightly different, so I can go ahead and create my host group, and you'll notice that this is a little quicker. I don't have to type the individual things, so I'm simply clicking on the hyperlinks. But I can go ahead and define my host group, set specific policies. So I'm still achieving the same thing that I was doing the other way, but here I get to pick a few more things if I go through the actual GUI deployment. If I save it, I get to the screen where I can go ahead and start defining the HMCs. I can go ahead and add the HMCs, and then you'll see that if I wind up having multiple HMCs in my environment beyond the two that were recommended, I can maybe select the first one and the second one, and I omitted 3 and 4. And then I can continue going through. Whatever hosts those HMCs actually see, I can go ahead and start selecting which ones are going to participate with my host group. Maybe not all of them will. So you'll see as I go down that host 5 is not going to actually participate within the host group. The LUNs that I mentioned earlier, I needed to have those two 10 gig disks. I can go ahead and select the cluster. The participating VIO servers that are going to play in the environment. So you'll see on the bottom I've got VIO 1 and 2, and I may have additional VIO servers that are just simply not going to participate. And then as I go through, here are the LUNs that are going to be getting utilized, where it's going to go ahead and form that shared storage pool cluster. And on the right hand side, you'll see that I've got the designation of those LUNs, and the sizes are different here. The recommendation is 10 gigs here. They are reflected as 15 and 20 gig disks. But 10 should totally suffice. But you'll see that the top one's the repository disk, the bottom one is the HA disk. And then as I go through, what's also different when I go through the GUI deployment path, I can go ahead and select the individual VMs. Instead of having it try to manage every single one of them, I can go ahead and say, well, maybe I only wanted to play with these particular ones. So I kind of like this path. As I go through, I select the VMs, and then I can go ahead and do the submit and deploy. So you'll get a nice little summary saying, hey, these are all the different things that you want to go ahead and push. I can submit. It'll go ahead and tee it off, and it'll go ahead and launch the actual dashboard. So I'll take you to the emulator dashboard for a sec, and then I'll just switch gears and I'll go into the actual GUI deployment that I've got for my particular environment. So once I go to the dashboard, you'll notice that this is a usable emulator, but there's no actual systems behind the scenes. So let me go ahead and exit from here, and I'll take you to the actual GUI in my environment. All right, and what I was just showing you was the actual emulator before. So now if I take you into the actual GUI for my particular environment, it'll take a sec just to go ahead and pull my topology into play. And once the screen loads up, I'll kind of take you through a few of the line items and give you a brief intro, and then in the follow-on videos we'll do the actual demonstrations as far as failures and the capabilities that you get. So at a high level, the GUI looks very similar to what you get with VM Recovery Manager for DR, which now, as of the June release, also has the management capabilities, or some of the management capabilities through GUI and through CLI. So you'll see that there's the name of my cases cluster. I happen to call it VMR-HA, and it resides in Poughkeepsie. HMCs, you'll notice that I've only got one in my configuration, even though they recommend multiple. The manage host is only going to show me 2 hosts. Here's my host group definition that I called Oracle VM HG. And then you'll see that some of the policies that I went through the actual emulator and could select. It'll take a sec to load those policies, but you'll see that there's and it's kind of grayed out in the back end right now, but you'll see that there's a restart policy, the HA monitoring, the host failure detection that I can specify. So there's a few policies that I can come in and update here. There's also some flex capacity stuff that, again, I'll cover in more detail in the follow-on recordings. And then you'll notice that I've got the ability to run my discovery and verification through the UI server here. Then I happen to only be playing with 2 hosts, so I've got an S824 and an S922, and you'll see that when I click on these guys, it does give me some of the utilization information on the right-hand side as far as the CPU and memory at the system level. Also, if I go ahead and I expand the systems, you'll notice that I've got my VIO servers visible, so 2 on the S922, and what it does by default is it tries to put the managed nodes up on top. So this is one of the managed nodes, and I would see that if I clicked on policies today. So I actually have to click on each individual VM, look at the policies, and you'll notice that it says that this one's managed. This is going to undergo a bit of a review. So in the upcoming December release, you should be able to identify the managed VMs on the left-hand side. And since I have a whole bunch of unmanaged VMs below, and I'll just show you an example of the very first one, just beneath my managed one that I know is unmanaged, you'll see that I would have to click on each individual one. So they're going to change the design and make it so that you'll see the managed ones and then the unmanaged ones below. So if you wanted to make a change, you could do so easily. On my other server, the S824, you see the 2 VL servers, and then here is my other managed VM. So here's the VRM Aura DB2 VM that I was playing with. It gives me some of the capacity and usage, so minimal resources. And where I kind of took this a step further is I have the VM monitoring enabled behind the scenes, and in addition to that, I have the application level monitoring enabled as well. So I'll take you into more detail as to how to go ahead and deploy the agents provided. Here I use the agent specific to Oracle, so you'll see the default values. It'll try to restart it 3 times before it tries to go ahead and either relocate it or perform some type of action. And if I look at my other cluster member, the one that I was also testing with PowerVM, on this particular one, instead of using one of the agents for the applications, I went ahead and I created my own custom application level monitor. So it's got the ability to start my application, stop it, and then also performs monitoring. And here you'll see that the max restarts I set to 1. You see the stabilization amount of time. And I did some testing with that, so I'll kind of show you what it takes to configure the VM level and the application level monitoring in the follow-on recordings. So I just wanted to give you a quick intro and show you what you see through the user interface, and then also the fact that if I wanted to click on a specific host, so let me go ahead and just click on the S824, I have the ability to evacuate the entire host and say all of my managed VMs, go ahead and migrate them to a new host, or migrate them back, or migrate things back to the home host. So I believe I skipped that piece. So let me go ahead and take you here, and if I go under the policies for one of my managed VMs, you'll notice that by default each host gets its own home host definition. So I could go ahead and alter this, and if I had up to 12 hosts, I could say, hey, all these guys, in the event that I ever wanted them to return back home, they're going to all go back to the designated host that was specified in these policies. There's also failover priorities, and there's some fancy placement things that you can do with this, or restart capabilities, and I'll show you some of those things again in follow-on videos. Also, to get the VM level monitoring enabled, I installed a package and I can set the enablement here on the right hand side. So you'll see that I can go ahead and detect if that VM fails, try to restart it, and then if I've got that agent and I exploit the application monitoring framework, it'll go ahead and try to restart my application as well. But before I was clicked down at the host level, here I'm clicked on at the VM level. So you'll notice that at the individual VM level, I can do the migrations, leveraging LPM away and then also back. And then I can restart those VMs from one host to the next host. In the event that they were offline, they were not set to automatically get restarted, I could go ahead and leverage this to go ahead and have it move the LPAR and restart it on a different host altogether. So let me stop there for this particular recording, and then in the follow-on one, in part 2, I'll do the actual failure demonstrations.